John and Emily Reynolds were the picture-perfect couple in Meadowbrook. John, a former Marine, was admired by everyone. His discipline, strength, and commitment to his job made him a respected figure. Emily, a kind-hearted woman, stayed at home to care for their 2 children. She was deeply involved in the community, always willing to help, always with a smile. But no one knew what really went on behind closed doors. John's job took him away for long stretches of time. He was a security consultant for a top firm, which meant frequent travel and late nights. Emily was left alone to manage everything at home. The kids, the house, the endless days without her husband. On the outside, their marriage seemed strong, but on the inside, Emily was slowly crumbling. The loneliness grew heavier with every day John was gone. Emily tried to fill her time with community events and church activities, but no matter how busy she stayed, it wasn't enough. She missed John, missed their connection, but his work consumed him. The distance between them grew, but no one in town suspected a thing. Emily's life took a new turn when Father Mark arrived at St. Mary's Church. He was unlike any priest the town had ever seen, charming, engaging, and with a way of making people feel heard. His sermons weren't just words, they touched people deeply. The church started filling up every Sunday, and Emily was one of the first to notice his unique presence. Father Mark had a special way of connecting with the parishioners, offering comfort and advice that felt personal. For Emily, struggling with her feelings of isolation, his presence was a welcome relief. She started spending more time at the church, volunteering for any event she could. At first it was innocent, but soon her visits became more frequent, and she found herself opening up to Father Mark in ways she never had before. What started as simple conversations about faith and life turned into something deeper. Emily felt seen, understood in a way that John never seemed to understand her anymore. And Father Mark, with his own hidden desires, was drawn to Emily's vulnerability. Neither of them could have imagined how far their relationship would go or the consequences that would follow. As time went on, the cracks in John and Emily's marriage became harder to ignore. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple. John's career success and Emily's involvement in the community made them seem like the ideal family. Neighbors admired their home, their well-behaved kids, and the way they seemed to have it all together. But appearances can be deceiving. John's long hours at work meant he was rarely home. When he was often too tired to connect with Emily or the kids. He loved his family, no doubt, but his job was his priority. Providing for them, ensuring their financial stability, that's what he believed mattered most. Emily, on the other hand, craved more than just a paycheck and a nice house. She wanted John's time, his attention, but no matter how much she tried, it always felt like she was competing with his work. In public, they still played the role of a happy couple, attending social gatherings and church events together. But behind closed doors, the distance between them only grew. Emily's loneliness became a constant companion, and John, too focused on his career, didn't notice the emotional void forming between them. What seemed like a perfect life from the outside was anything but. Emily's involvement at the church continued to deepen, and with each visit, her connection to Father Mark grew stronger. At first, it was subtle, small conversations after Mass, a few minutes here and there discussing community projects. But soon, these talks stretched longer, becoming more personal. Emily found comfort in Father Mark's words, a kind of attention she hadn't felt in years. Father Mark seemed to understand her struggles in a way no one else did. He listened patiently as she spoke about her feelings of isolation, her longing for more in life. His advice felt sincere, his presence a calming force in her otherwise lonely world. What started as simple confessions and shared frustrations soon transformed into something much deeper, something more dangerous. The boundaries between them began to blur. Emily wasn't just confiding in him as a priest anymore, she was leaning on him as a friend, and soon as something more. The bond they shared quickly grew into a secret they both held close, unaware of how this connection would soon spiral out of control. Father Mark, with his hidden intentions, took advantage of Emily's vulnerability, and she, desperate for any sense of connection, fell deeper into his grasp. As with any small town, secrets were hard to keep in Meadowbrook. What had started between Emily and Father Mark in quiet whispers and stolen moments was becoming too noticeable to ignore. Emily, once the devoted wife and active member of the community, started to act differently. She was more distant from John, more distracted in her daily life, and people began to talk. The church was no longer just a place of spiritual refuge for her, it had become a place of emotional escape. Father Mark's attention had filled the void in her life, but their growing closeness didn't go unnoticed. In a town where everyone knew each other's business, subtle changes in behavior stood out like a sore thumb. Emily's late nights at the church, the lingering looks between her and Father Mark, it all added up in the eyes of the gossiping townspeople. The rumors spread quickly, as they always do in small communities. At first it was just speculation, but as more people started noticing the shifts in both Emily and Father Mark's behavior, the whispers turned into scandalous accusations. Meadowbrook, once peaceful and unassuming, was now buzzing with talk about the affair between the priest and the lonely wife. It wasn't long before the scandal that started in secrecy would come to light, with consequences far more damaging than anyone could have imagined. As the affair between Emily and Father Mark deepened, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, he dismissed the changes in Emily's behavior, chalking it up to his long absences and the stress of managing the household alone. But over time, the signs became too obvious to ignore. Emily was distant, emotionally cold, and there were too many unexplained late nights at the church. John wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the odd phone calls, the sudden need for privacy, and the secretive looks Emily tried to hide told him something wasn't right. He started paying closer attention to her actions, noticing the small things, her hesitation when he asked about her day, the way she seemed lost in thought, as if her mind was elsewhere. He didn't want to believe the worst, but a nagging suspicion grew within him. As John began to piece together the subtle clues, his once stable world started to crumble. The more he observed, the more certain he became that Emily was hiding something. The wife he thought he knew so well was slipping away, and with each passing day, John felt a sense of betrayal brewing. His job, which had once been his escape, now felt like a burden, keeping him from uncovering the truth. Little did he know, his suspicions were about to lead him into a confrontation that would change everything. As John's suspicions grew, another, more sinister truth about Father Mark began to surface. For all his charm and spiritual guidance, Father Mark had been hiding a past full of dark secrets. He wasn't the first priest in Meadowbrook, but he was certainly the most captivating. His sermons, his way of connecting with the parishioners, everything about him seemed almost too good to be true. And that's because it was. Unbeknownst to most, Father Mark had a history of inappropriate relationships with women in the church. In every town he'd served, there had been whispers of private meetings and emotional connections that crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable for a man of the cloth. But those rumors were always hushed up, swept under the rug before they could gain any real attention. Father Mark was always transferred before any scandal could break out. Emily wasn't the first woman to fall under his spell. There had been others, vulnerable women, who had confided in him, only to find themselves trapped in something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. His past relationships had all followed a pattern. He'd offer support, build trust, and slowly, things would become more personal. Each time he was able to escape the consequences by moving to a new parish, leaving the damage behind. But this time, in Meadowbrook, things were different. His actions were catching up with him, and the affair with Emily was spiraling into something far more serious. The darkness of his past was about to collide with the present in a way that no one could ignore. The turning point came when David, a regular churchgoer, stumbled upon a secret that Father Mark would do anything to keep hidden. David, known for being involved in the church's activities, had noticed the strange closeness between Emily and Father Mark. One evening, he saw something that confirmed his worst suspicions: Emily and Father Mark sharing a kiss inside the confessional booth. Shocked and furious, David confronted Father Mark, demanding that he come clean about the affair. But Father Mark wasn't about to let his carefully constructed life fall apart. David's discovery was a threat, and Father Mark's desperation grew. He couldn't afford for the truth to come out, not now, not ever. So, in a moment of panic, Father Mark devised a plan. Under the guise of wanting to talk things over, he convinced David to meet him at the church's bell tower, a quiet, secluded place where no one would hear them. Once there, Father Mark turned the conversation dark. As David pressed for answers, Father Mark led him closer to the edge, his mind racing with fear of exposure. In a swift, cold-blooded move, Father Mark pushed David off the tower. David's scream echoed through the night, cut short by the sickening sound of his body hitting the ground. The sight of David lying lifeless below sent a shiver down Father Mark's spine. But there was no turning back now. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. David was dead, and Father Mark's secret was buried with him for now. After the murder, Father Mark knew he had to act fast. The weight of what he had done was heavy, but his fear of being exposed outweighed any guilt he felt. He hurried down from the bell tower, his heart pounding as he checked to make sure no one had seen what happened. The church was empty, the night still, but time was running out. Father Mark dragged David's body into the church's basement, a place rarely used and filled with old, forgotten things. He covered the body with dusty, unused supplies, hoping it would buy him enough time to figure out his next move. Every second felt like a lifetime as he tried to calm his racing mind. He couldn't afford to slip up, not now, not after everything he had already risked. Over the next few days, Father Mark carried on as though nothing had happened. He delivered his sermons, met with parishioners, and even comforted those who were worried about David's sudden disappearance. Inside, though, he was anything but calm. Every creak of the church, every shadow in the corner of his eye, felt like it could be someone discovering his secret. But outwardly, he remained collected, convincing everyone around him that David had simply left town. The community began to move on, the whispers about David fading as time passed without any leads. For a while, it seemed like Father Mark had pulled off the impossible. He had silenced the one person who could destroy him, and now he just needed to keep his secrets hidden. Yet the burden of his actions was growing, and no amount of hiding would change the fact that the cover-up was only the beginning of his unraveling. John had been growing more suspicious by the day, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to discover. He had pieced together the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and Emily's sudden emotional distance, but he still clung to the hope that it wasn't what he feared. That hope shattered the moment he decided to follow Emily one afternoon. It was a gloomy, overcast day when John trailed her to St. Mary's Church. He watched from a distance as she entered, her steps hurried, as if she were meeting someone. Heart pounding, John slipped inside quietly and hid in the shadows near the altar. What he saw next confirmed his worst nightmare. Emily, the woman he had loved for over a decade, stood close to Father Mark, their conversation filled with hushed tones and stolen glances. The way Father Mark touched her arm, the way she smiled, it was all too much for John to bear. In that moment, every suspicion, every doubt, came crashing down on him. The truth was undeniable. Emily was having an affair with the priest. John's chest tightened with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He could feel the betrayal like a knife twisting inside him. Before he could stop himself, John burst from his hiding place, his voice shaking with anger as he confronted them. Emily's face turned white, her eyes wide with fear. Father Mark, usually calm and composed, stood frozen, caught in the act. The room was thick with tension as John unleashed his fury, demanding answers that neither Emily nor Father Mark could give. The betrayal from the two people he trusted most cut deep, and from that moment on, everything changed. What followed would not only destroy their lives, but lead them down a path of violence and tragedy that none of them could have imagined. After the violent confrontation with John, Father Mark knew he couldn't stay in Meadowbrook any longer. With John dead and Emily in shock, there was no hiding the truth anymore. He had crossed too many lines, broken too many rules, and the consequences were closing in on him fast. He had to flee before anyone could connect him to what had happened. Father Mark didn't waste any time. The night was dark, and he used it to his advantage. He slipped out of the church unnoticed, adrenaline pushing him forward. Every sound around him felt like it could be the police or someone discovering what he had done. His hands were still stained with John's blood, and his mind raced with fear and guilt. He knew the police would be coming, and once they started asking questions, it would be over. He moved quickly through the back alleys of the town, avoiding the main streets and staying in the shadows. His goal was to reach the woods on the outskirts of Meadowbrook. If he could just get there, he might have a chance to disappear, to outrun the law. The forest was thick and confusing, but it offered the only hope he had left: a place to hide, to lose the people chasing him. But Father Mark's escape wasn't as smooth as he had hoped. Detective Miller, the lead officer in the investigation, was already one step ahead. The manhunt had begun, and roadblocks were being set up at every exit out of town. The police were closing in, and Father Mark's chances of slipping away unnoticed were getting slimmer by the minute. As he entered the dark, dense woods, the weight of his crimes bore down on him. He could run, but he couldn't escape what he had done. As the manhunt for Father Mark intensified, the police turned their focus on St. Mary's Church. Detective Miller, known for her sharp instincts, had a gut feeling that the church held more secrets than anyone realized. While Father Mark was still on the run, the investigation inside the church began in earnest. Officers combed through every room, every corner, looking for clues that might explain the chaotic events that had unfolded. What they found was far worse than anyone had expected. During a thorough search of the church's basement, when officers stumbled upon something hidden beneath old, dusty church supplies. The smell hit them first, a foul, unmistakable odor of death. Buried under years of forgotten clutter was the decomposed body of David, the churchgoer who had mysteriously disappeared weeks earlier. His body, twisted and broken from the fall, painted a gruesome picture of what had really happened. The discovery of David's body sent shockwaves through the investigation. Up until this point, the police had been focused solely on the murder of John Reynolds. Now they had a second victim, and the connection between both deaths became clear. Father Mark wasn't just guilty of an affair, he was a murderer, willing to do anything to protect his dark secrets. As news of David's body spread, the peaceful town of Meadowbrook was shaken to its core. What had once been a place of trust and faith now stood as the backdrop for deception and violence. The police knew that with this discovery, Father Mark's days as a free man were numbered. The evidence was undeniable, and now it was only a matter of time before justice caught up with him. With the discovery of David's body, the urgency to capture Father Mark grew tenfold. The police knew they were dealing with a man who had not only broken his vows but had taken lives to protect his secrets. Detective Miller, determined to bring him to justice, organized a full-scale manhunt. Officers spread out across the town, and every exit from Meadowbrook was blocked. Father Mark had become the most wanted man in the region. The thick woods surrounding the town became the primary search area. Father Mark was smart, and the dense forest offered him a perfect place to hide. But he wasn't prepared for the relentless pursuit led by Detective Miller. Search dogs were brought in, helicopters hovered overhead, and officers moved through the forest with flashlights cutting through the early morning mist. They weren't going to let him slip away easily. As Father Mark stumbled through the woods, exhaustion began to take over. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent his heart racing. He was running on pure fear, knowing that his time was running out. He had no plan, no clear direction, just the desperate hope of escaping the nightmare he had created. But the net was closing in. The officers followed his trail, finding signs of his presence: broken branches, disturbed ground, even a scrap of his torn clothing. Detective Miller's team was closing the gap, and Father Mark, already worn down from days on the run, knew it. The police dogs began barking louder as they picked up his scent, and the wail of sirens grew closer. Father Mark's escape had turned into a race against time, and the end was near. As Father Mark pushed deeper into the woods, his strength was failing. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs heavy with exhaustion. The sound of barking dogs and distant voices was getting louder. There was no escaping it now. Just when he thought he could go no further, he stumbled into a clearing. The bright beams of police flashlights cut through the trees, and within moments he was surrounded. "Freeze. Put your hands where we can see them." Detective Miller's voice was firm and unyielding. Father Mark, knowing there was no way out, slowly raised his blood-stained hands. The reality of his situation crashed down on him as he dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his actions. There was no running anymore. The officers moved in swiftly, handcuffing him and leading him away from the forest that had been his last hope. The town of Meadowbrook watched in shock as Father Mark was taken into custody. The once respected priest was now a prisoner, his crimes exposed for all to see. His trial, which followed shortly after his capture, was swift. The evidence against him, David's body, John's murder, and the countless testimonies from witnesses left no room for doubt. Father Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he sat in his cell, the gravity of his crimes bore down on him. The iron bars and cold concrete walls were a constant reminder of the lives he had destroyed. There would be no redemption for him, no forgiveness. Meadowbrook slowly began to heal, but the memory of Father Mark's betrayal and the tragic events that followed would haunt the town for years to come. Father Mark's escape had failed, and now he was left to face the consequences of his dark deeds, locked away forever. In the cold, unforgiving walls of his prison cell, Father Mark was left with nothing but the weight of his conscience. The trial had been a formality. There was no question about his guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community that once trusted him now watched as justice took its course. The courtroom was filled with people who had once looked to him for spiritual guidance, now staring at him with disbelief and anger. Father Mark barely spoke during the trial. His face, once so composed and confident, was now pale and haunted. The prosecution laid out the chilling details: John's brutal murder, the cover-up of David's death, and the betrayal of Emily, who had also been left in emotional ruin. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, painted a darker picture of the man they had once known. When the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without parole, there was no outcry, no shock. It was what everyone had expected. Father Mark was led away in silence, the weight of his crimes settling in with every step. The doors of the courtroom closed behind him, sealing his fate. For the rest of his life, he would sit behind bars, his dark past and unforgivable actions haunting him every day. The town of Meadowbrook would never be the same. The church, once a place of hope and solace, now stood as a stark reminder of the betrayal that had torn the community apart. Father Mark, a man who had once been a trusted figure, was now a symbol of the darkness that had briefly consumed the town. As the years passed, the people of Meadowbrook would move on, but the scars left by Father Mark's crimes would never fully fade.